Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me. Bless his holy name.
Eastern Christianity, icons typically plays a huge role in our devotional life and our spiritual life. We view icons as windows into heaven. In other words, they're meant to kind of, shed some light on spiritual realities. If you look at an icon, they're flat, one-dimensional, and they're not realistic. They're not like a painting. Like they're not like a Rembrandt painting, but rather they're meant to reflect something different than the regular physical world. So if you find an icon that depicts a story from the Bible, it's not going to try to be realistic. It's purposely very stylized because it's meant to reflect spiritual realities, not necessarily historical or physical realities. But the icons usually contain theology. In a way, they're theology and art. There are different symbols you find in icons that represent different things. Colors can have certain significances. And if you grow up, in an Eastern Christian tradition, you become familiar with what some of these symbols mean, and you can kind of understand what it's trying to say. So the symbolism in it's very important. But ultimately, icons are things we show devotion to. We show veneration to them. Now, we do not worship icons, just like, Roman Catholics do not worship statues. Ultimately, worship only goes towards God. But an icon functions in some ways kind of like a picture of a loved one. You may have a photograph of a grandparent or a deceased friend. You look at that and you remember them. You recall that they were a part of your life and that perhaps you're still connected to them in some way. Because a person who's with God in heaven is more alive than we are now in some ways. And they're still connected to us. So when you look at an icon of a saint, for instance, the icon reminds you that you're connected to that saint, that person is still a part of your life in some way. But the other thing is this. In the Eastern tradition, we believe that when we gather to worship God, we're plugging into a liturgy that takes place in heaven. You see, whenever we see glimpses of heaven in the scriptures, it's not people, laying around playing harps, but rather what we see is worship. We see people gathered around God's throne in worship. And we believe that when we worship God on earth, we're joining with that worship in heaven. We're kind of joining in with it and plugging into it. They're kind of merging in a sense. And when we're worshiping God, those angels and saints are present with us. So in our churches, we have icons all over the place. Typically, there's an icon screen in the front usually, and there's icons on the walls. And that's to remind us that we're not alone when we worship, that the angels and saints are with us. As St. Paul says in Hebrews, we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. So we like to have lots of icons around us to remind us of that great cloud of witnesses. So icons play an important role in our worship of God as well for that reason.